I was listening to the latest podcast episode for Cool Colas, and shout out to him. Many of y'all are familiar with who he is because I've had him on my channel a couple of times. And what I'll do is I'll leave the link to his podcast in the description. Make sure y'all go and check that out. It's a really, really good podcast. And he had brought up, he did like a Q&A type of questioning because it was his last episode for his first season of his podcast. And he was answering one of the questions, and the topic of quote unquote toxic masculinity came up. And he had mentioned the person's name who was responsible for coining the phrase of toxic masculinity. And the crazy part about it is I think I talked about this before in the past about this individual, but it's been a while, so I'm going to basically be giving people a refresher. And if this is my first time talking about it, then this is an eye-opening thing for people who are unaware of where that phrase came from, especially since so many people, especially a lot of women, use that phrase so freely. What if I was to tell you that the term toxic masculinity, while used mainly by women, was not coined by a woman? What if I was to tell you that it was coined by a man? What if I was to tell you that that man that I'm talking about is on your screen right now, and his name is Shepperd Bliss? Shepperd Bliss is the father of toxic masculinity, meaning he's the one that coined the phrase. And while it may not be a shock to anybody, this guy's also in the academy. So there you go. What does that tell you? This guy seems to have had it out for heterosexual men from Jump Street, because this toxic masculinity phrasing is far from new. And I mean, you're going to find out some more, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to read is a pretty lengthy article, because I want people to really grasp what it is that they've latched themselves onto, and how that thing has been a big detriment, especially to black boys and black men. Because I have the strongest inkling that that toxic masculinity phrase has really, really latched itself on to black men as almost as a weapon to try to quote unquote tone down black men, heterosexual black men, that is. Because I find there's a lot of men in the black men in the academy who love to use this word as well. I'm not going to go way too deep into why I say that, but I think many of you know why. But it says toxic masculinity is a set of male behaviors associated with harm to society and men themselves. Traditional stereotypes of men as socially dominant, along with related traits such as misogyny and homophobia, can be considered toxic, due in part to their promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. The violent socialization of boys often normalizes violence, such as the saying, "boys will be boys," about bullying and aggression. You want to know what's so interesting? I have asked for the longest time, ever since I heard that term toxic masculinity, why isn't there a term of toxic femininity? Because everything that this person said right here, but if you switch misogyny to misandry, could relate to a woman as well. Because they try to make it seem like a woman cannot be violent. Y'all must not see some of these videos. Y'all must not see how some of these women out here be acting. That is considered toxic femininity. I don't give a damn if they don't want to call it it. I'm calling it that. But they said, oh, there's no such thing as toxic femininity. I remember I had posted that up somewhere, maybe on Twitter or somewhere, and I literally got grilled in the comment section by all these feminists saying there's no such thing as toxic femininity. And I bet every last one of them don't even have a man. And I bet you a lot of them act as aggressive as a man. Some of them might think they are a man. Go figure. Self-reliance and emotional repression are correlated with increased psychological problems in men, such as depression, increased stress, and substance use disorders. Toxic masculine traits are characteristics of the unspoken code of behavior among men in prisons, where they exist in part as a response to the harsh conditions of prison life. So now you're inserting that, now that because if a man expresses true dominance and, bathing in sulking in his masculinity, not as compared to that as someone who lives in prison. See how it's worded? Again, this is the guy that came up with the phrase toxic masculinity. The way they was able to come up with this stuff was because of what he put out there. These are basically his words. Other traditionally masculine traits such as devotion to work, pride in excelling at sports, and providing for one's family are not considered to be toxic. The concept was originally used by authors associated with the mythopoetic men's movement, such as Shepperd Bliss, who was the guy that we have on here. Now, he was talking about the men's movement. Now, when they had women's lib, when they were all out there burning their bras and all this type of stuff, they did not once have a phrase coined called toxic femininity. These authors contrast the stereotypical notions of masculinity with a real or deep masculinity, which they said men had lost touch with in modern society. Critics of the term toxic masculinity argue it incorrectly implies that gender-related issues are caused by inherent male traits. The concept of toxic masculinity, or certain formulations of it, has been criticized by some conservatives as an undue condemnation of traditional masculinity, and by some feminists as an essentialist concept that ignores the role of choice in context is causing harmful behaviors and attitudes related to masculinity. The term toxic masculinity originated in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s. It later found wide use in both academic and popular writing. Popular and media discussions in the 2010s have used the term to refer to traditional and stereotypical norms of masculinity and manhood. According to the sociologist Michael Flood, these include expectations that boys and men must be active, aggressive, tough, daring, and dominant. I bet you if you flipped all of those things around and say make him soft, feminine, and a bunch of other things that's related to a woman, they would say that's just him expressing his feminine side. I hope y'all are getting the gist of what's going on. They really, everything that I just read as far as the traits, if they do the opposite of that or something that's more related to a woman, that's what they really are trying to steer boys into. Because see, they have to get the boys first before they actually get them, before they enter into manhood. Because by the time they enter manhood, many of them already know what path they're taking or what direction they're heading. There's really nothing to change, but get them while they're young, while they're impressionable, and maybe we can quote unquote change them or shift them or steer them. Some authors associated with the mythopoetic men's movement have referred to the social pressures placed upon men to be violent, competitive, independent, and unfeeling as a quote-unquote toxic form of masculinity, in contrast to a real or deep masculinity that they say men have lost touch with within modern society. I find it interesting when they talk about independent, because there's a lot of women out here that, you know, they bad and bougie. They a boss bitch. She can do everything for herself. She don't need a man. Again, a lot of the traits that they say is associated with this toxic masculinity can be associated with a lot of these women, but they never gave them the label of toxic femininity. Like they literally are saying that this toxic masculinity just stands on its own. It doesn't have a balancing out with the opposite side. The academic Shepperd Bliss proposed a return to agrarianism, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce it, as an alternative to the potentially toxic masculinity of the warrior ethic. Sociologist Michael Kimmel writes that Bliss's notion of toxic masculinity be seen as part of the mythopoetic movement's response to male feelings or powerlessness at a time when the feminist movement was challenging traditional male authority. Thus, Shepperd Bliss, for example, rails against what he calls toxic masculinity, which he believes is responsible for the most of the evil in the world, and proclaims the unheralded goodness of the men who fight the fires into the soil and nurture their families. Look at what he said, which he believes is responsible for most of the evil in the world. If that toxic masculinity label is thrusted and thrown upon black boys and black men, what are they telling you? That black boys and black men are the most evil in the world. Big black boogeyman, Think about how D.W. Griffith set up that trash, horrible movie, Birth of a Nation, and how they had to make black men be seen as this monster, as this beast of burden. Fast forward to him coining the phrase toxic masculinity. I mean, is this a coincidence? I don't think so. In the social sciences, toxic masculinity refers to traditional cultural masculine norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. This concept of toxic masculinity does not condemn men or male attributes, but rather emphasizes the harmful effects of conformity to certain traditional masculine ideal behaviors, such as dominance, self-reliance, and competition. Those are three major traits in what makes a man, and they are trying to tell us that that is toxic. Dominance, self-reliance, and competition. Basically, they're saying we could be a whole man if we just remove those three things. Well, you can't. That's the thing. Toxic masculinity is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions boys and men may comfortably express while elevating other emotions such as anger. It is marked by economic, political, and social expectations that men seek and achieve dominance. In a gender studies context, Raywin Kano refers to toxic practices that may arise out of what she terms hegemonic masculinity rather than essential traits. Connell argues that such practices such as physical violence may serve to reinforce men's dominance over women in Western societies. She stresses that such practices are a salient feature of hegemonic masculinity, although not always the defining features. Terry Coopers describes toxic masculinity as involving the need to aggressively compete and dominate others, and as the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. Again, and this is my third time saying it, all the stuff that they're saying that they're putting onto men with the toxic masculinity, that can easily be put onto women with toxic femininity, but they claim they don't have a terminology for that because they have to keep it solely on the men. He contrasts these traits with more positive traits such as pride in one's ability to win at sports, to maintain solidarity with a friend, to succeed at work, or to provide for one's family. Feminist author John Stoltenberg has argued that all traditional notions of masculinity are toxic and reinforce the oppression of women. Now, peep that. Feminist author John Stoltenberg. So here you have a most likely definitely a PC man with that last name, Berg, them folks, who's a feminist. So here we have this PC man who's a part of the academy coining a phrase called toxic masculinity, which is basically widely used amongst every feminist in the book. And speaking of books, you have one who is part of them folks who is a feminist himself, who wrote books about feminism in support of it, and how to just beat down and make sure that we tackle these toxic men. I guess God code does not apply to them. I think it's pretty obvious. Again, that's another PC man who was a quote unquote feminist. I'm telling you right now, don't trust any man that calls himself a feminist. I'm just saying. According to Coopers, toxic masculine norms are a feature of life for men in American prisons, where they are reflected in the behavior of both staff and inmates. The qualities of extreme self-reliance, domination of other men through violence, and avoiding appearance of either femininity or weakness comprise an unspoken code among prisoners. Suppressing vulnerable emotions is often adopted to successfully cope with the harsh conditions of prison life, defined by punishment, social isolation, and aggression. These factors likely play a role in suicide among male prisoners. Toxic masculinity can also take the form of bullying of boys by their peers and domestic violence directed towards boys at home. The often violent socialization of boys produces psychological trauma through the promotion of aggression and lack of interpersonal connection. Such trauma is often disregarded, such as in the saying "boys will be boys" about bullying. The promotion of idealized masculine roles emphasizing toughness, dominance, self-reliance, and the restriction of emotion can begin as early as infancy. Such norms are transmitted by parents, other male relatives, and members of the community. Media representations of masculinity on websites such as YouTube often promote similar stereotypical gender roles. That means they watching some of them, probably some of those manosphere channels. Those are the only ones I can really think of that they would target for them to mention YouTube. According to Ronald F. Levant and others, traditionally prescribed masculine behaviors can produce harmful effects, including violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence, promiscuity, risky and or social or irresponsible behaviors, including substance use disorders and dysfunction in relationships. Again, look at all these examples that they're using. Again, that doesn't always have to fall on the man, but okay, I know that's like beating a dead horse. The American Psychological Association has warned that traditional masculinity ideology is associated with negative effects on mental and physical health. Men who adhere to traditionally masculine cultural norms such as risk-taking, violence, dominance, the primary of work, need for emotional control, desire to win in the pursuit of social status, tend to more likely experience psychological problems such as depression, stress, body image, substance use, and poor social functioning. Now, out of everything that I just read, that one is probably the one I agree with the most, or probably the only thing I agree with, because I do believe that when people who tend to be overachievers will go through some levels of depression. That I do agree with. If I don't agree with anything else in this article or what I'm reading, which really isn't anything, that part I do agree with. The effect tends to be stronger in men who also emphasize toxic masculine norms, such as self-reliance, seeking power over women, and sexual promiscuity or playboy behavior. The social value of self-reliance has diminished over time as modern American society has moved toward interdependence. Both self-reliance and the stifling of emotional expression can work against mental health, as they make it less likely for men to seek psychological help or to possess the ability to deal with difficult emotions. So basically, this is the part where they're talking about how a lot of men don't go to therapy or seek help whenever they clearly need help. And people are suggesting that they don't, but they don't want to go and talk to anyone because they don't want to express their feelings. You want to know why that is? Because society for so long has told black men, well, I'm gonna say black men, well, and men in general, especially black men, to show no emotions, because showing emotions makes you weak. That's why it's almost as if it doesn't allow the boy who grows into a man to become a whole person. It's almost like he's a semicircle. Like, oh, he doesn't make a full 360. He only goes 180, and sometimes doesn't even make it to the 180. They might make it to 175 or 165 or 155. Some people's circle doesn't even come until later or starts until later. So that's why a lot of men are told to not wear their heart on their sleeve. See, they don't get the pass that a woman would, to where she can show and express her emotions, because that's the womanly thing to do. So that's why a lot of men will bottle up their emotions. That's why you can't even pull tears out of some men. They may feel some way inside, but guess what? You can't see what's going on internally. You can only see what's expressed outwardly. Let's talk about that. Toxic masculinity is also implicated in socially created public health problems such as elevated rates of alcoholism and certain types of cancer among men, or the role of trophy hunting, sexual behaviors, and rates of transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Psychiatrist Frank Pittman wrote about how men are harmed by traditional masculine norms, suggesting this includes shorter lifespans, greater incidence of violence, a violent death, and ailments such as lung cancer and cirrhosis of the liver. Some conservatives, as well as many in the alt-right, see toxic masculinity as an incoherent concept or belief that there is no such thing as toxic masculinity. In January 2019, conservative political commentators criticized the New American Psychological Association guidelines for warning about harms associated with traditional masculinity ideology, arguing that it constitutes an attack on masculinity. APA chief of professional practice Jared Skillings responded to conservative criticism, stating that the report's discussion of traditional masculinity is about negative traits such as violence or overcompetitiveness or being unwilling to admit weakness, and noting that the report also discusses positive traits traditionally associated with masculinity such as courage, leadership, and protectiveness. Have you noticed that a lot of the people that have a criticism, who have been on the side of toxic masculinity as far as pushing it, the narrative forward, are PC men? I think it was only one woman mentioned in this whole article, but it's mainly PC men that are pushing it. Here you got the guy who coined the phrase, then you had the feminist author, that man. Now you had this last guy that I mentioned, and you had the woman. And I think it was another man mentioned somewhere earlier in the article as well, who was PC himself. So notice that this toxic masculinity terminology and where it came from and who uses it the most. There's a reason I'm doing this video, because this is a topic that rarely ever gets talked about. People bring up toxic masculinity all the time, but they don't know where it came from. Many people don't even know or are aware of what it is that I just read to them. A lot of them, this is probably their first time being exposed to what the true definition of what toxic masculinity is, or where it came from and from who. But Shepperd Bliss, who I found out it said he has a PhD and he teaches psychology at John F. Kennedy University of Orinda, California. I don't know if he still teaches there, but that's a part of his resume. But there you go. Y'all pretty much got a little rundown of what toxic masculinity is, who it's targeting. I even gave you examples of where they could go with toxic femininity, but they don't want to talk about that. And that could be easy to do. It's crazy because where I read this from, when I typed toxic femininity in there, they don't have a rundown of what that is. They gave one little definition, and it says those aspects of traditional femininity perceived to reinforce neuroticism, hysteria, and other negative qualities theorized as a component of feminine ideology, particularly in the United States. And that's as far as it goes. And it also says that toxic femininity is a broad term that refers to a rigid or repressive definition of womanhood, including pressures women face to restrict themselves to stereotypically feminine traits and characteristics. When I read that, it almost makes it seem like it's putting them in a victim position, whereas when it came to toxic masculinity, it put them in a villain position. So even with how they're defining toxic femininity, they're still getting some kind of support system there. Whereas when they do toxic masculinity, it's almost like they sound like these men were created in a vacuum, or created, by Frankenstein. So there's a slight difference right there. And I just read to you what it is. And the definition I read was posted a few months ago this year. But look at how long it took for them to even come up with that. And even then, they're still giving the women cover. Not saying that they shouldn't or anything like that, but when you look at how that's defined versus how toxic masculinity is defined, one, they really gave a whole rundown of what they could deem as toxic masculinity. With toxic femininity, it's like we still gotta care for her like the delicate flower and dandelion that she is, even though a lot of the time she can act like the black dahlia flower. Just saying. But yeah, I just wanted to come on here and give that take right there, because I want people to understand and know, especially if you are one of those black feminists, even though I really think that there's really no hope for you, where you are getting your talking points from. But then again, whether this guy's in the academy or not, he's still a zaddy to many of you. So y'all will worship the ground that he walks on and literally eat up everything that he put out there. Again, this is a terminology that has been around for years. It's just that it didn't ramp up as far as being used like that until much, much, much later. And I think that's because with the advent of social media, that's where they were able to use it the most. But okay, again, let's not sit here and pretend that toxic femininity is not a thing when you can clearly go online and look up stuff where it's definitely present. And as far as Shepperd Bliss goes, well, not just him, but a lot of people, y'all really need to do y'all research on who you are taking your cues from. Like, seriously. That way you are aware of what it is that you are subscribing to.